Rolex is one of the most luxury brands in the world, valued today at around $8 billion. Its history dates back a century ago and began with an orphan teenager whose inheritance was stolen away from him. With nothing other than his determination to overcome his challenges, he ran away from his hometown and moved to another country. After a few years working his way out, he decided to follow his passion and opened a watchmaking business. Little did he know that this business venture would lead him to pioneer modern wristwatches, changing its whole industry and creating a billion-dollar empire. Hans Wilsdorf was born in Kulmbach, Germany on March 22, 1881, to parents Anna and Johann Daniel Wilsdorf. He was the second son of 3 children. His family ran a fairly successful business selling iron goods, classifying them in the middle-range class. Unfortunately, his mother got ill and died in 1892. To make it worse, a year later his dad would pass away too, leaving Hans an orphan at the age of 12. Now under the custody of his mother's brothers, his uncle immediately decided to sell his family's business and use some of the money for their education, putting all 3 of them in a prestigious boarding school in Bavaria, Germany. Hans hated this decision early on and became depressed. He was seen as an outsider and was often teased by other boys because of his religion. To get through his difficult childhood, he decided to focus on school. As he got older, he understood that even though he didn't like the decision of his uncles, it became an important factor for his success. Our uncles were not indifferent to our fate. Nevertheless, the way in which they made me become self-reliant very early in life made me acquire the habit of looking after my possessions, and looking back, I believe that it is to this that much of my success is due. Hans enjoyed reading books and became quite the bright student. The subjects he most notably excelled in were mathematics and languages, where he learned French and English. During school, he became friends with a Swiss boy who told him stories of his birthplace in La Chaux-de-Fonds, a city in Switzerland well known for its watchmaking industry, and Hans became intrigued about the place. One day, Hans had enough of his life and left the boarding school in Germany to move to Geneva, Switzerland at the age of 19. He got himself a job as an apprentice for an international pearl exporting company. There, he immersed himself in learning their business tactics and was making good money for his age. Later, Hans received a letter from his friend who offered him a job at Kuno Korten, one of the biggest high-quality watchmaking businesses at the time. Even though his current job was more beneficial, his curiosity for watches was stronger. In 1900, he moved to La Chaux-de-Fonds to work for this company as an English correspondent and clerk, earning 80 Swiss francs monthly. He was also responsible for winding hundreds of pocket watches every day and verifying their accuracy, gaining tremendous insight into watchmaking. After 2 years at Kuno Korten, Hans had to return to Germany for military service. After his service, at 22 years old, he moved to London to work for another high-quality watch company. There, he successfully grew their sales and was already thinking about building his own watch business. During those years, he met his future wife, Florence Frances May Crotty. One day, Hans was sitting with his brother-in-law, Alfred James Davis, and talked about his plans to open his own watch business, but mentioned he needed capital. Alfred took a chance on the young German and invested in his business venture. In 1905, they founded Wilsdorf and Davis Limited, which would eventually become Rolex. Hans partnered with a Swiss watch company and started importing movements from Switzerland to England. Soon after, they were specializing in the distribution of timepieces at affordable rates. However, Hans found one major thing unfavorable about the watch industry: pocket watches. At the time, wristwatches were mostly worn by women and were considered imprecise. Their smaller size meant smaller movements, which made them less reliable than pocket watches. For Hans, pocket watches were inconvenient, especially when his hands were busy. In 1914, he boldly predicted, "My personal opinion is that pocket watches will almost completely disappear and that wristwatches will replace them definitively." Hans spent years traveling across Europe, meeting countless watchmakers. He started releasing his own wristwatches, crafting better, more reliable models. By 1908, his company was one of the top firms in England's watchmaking industry. Hans wanted to change his company's name to something high-class, catchy, and easy to say in any language. After much consideration, Rolex was born. He registered the Rolex name as a trademark for Wilsdorf and Davis Limited in 1908. During World War I, when many businesses struggled, Rolex became more famous because of its reliable wristwatches. Many soldiers preferred Rolex watches over pocket watches for their precision and ease of use in combat. In 1914, Britain applied a 33% tax for companies exporting goods internationally. Additionally, anti-German sentiment was rising due to the war. Hans moved his company's headquarters to Switzerland and changed the name from Wilsdorf and Davis Limited to the Rolex Watch Corporation Limited in 1915. Years later, Hans registered Rolex's famous five-star crown logo. In 1919, the company moved its main office to Geneva, where it still stands today. It's in Geneva where Hans focused on improving the technical innovation of the wristwatch. We must succeed in making the watch case so tight that our movements will be permanently guaranteed against damage caused by dust, perspiration, water, heat, and cold. Only then will the perfect accuracy of the Rolex watch be secured. In 1926, Rolex released their revolutionary model, the Rolex Oyster, the first ever waterproof wristwatch in history. To showcase this innovation, Hans employed a brilliant marketing strategy. In 1927, when Mercedes Galizia attempted to swim the English Channel, Hans convinced her to wear a Rolex Oyster. Though she didn't complete the swim, the watch emerged in perfect condition. Hans capitalized on this publicity with an advertisement in the London Daily Mail. He also displayed Rolex oysters in fish bowls with real fish in every dealership window. In 1928, he worked with top British model Evelyn Leigh, publishing photos of her wearing a Rolex underwater. The publicity continued with Rolex watches being worn during a flight over Mount Everest in 1933, and by race car driver Malcolm Campbell when he set a 300-mile-per-hour speed record in 1935. These endorsements position Rolex as not just luxurious, but reliable for professionals in extreme conditions. In 1931, Rolex introduced the Oyster Perpetual, the first waterproof and self-winding wristwatch. World War II presented challenges for Rolex, making exports difficult. During this period, Hans also suffered when his wife passed away in 1944. He established the Wilsdorf Foundation in her memory. After World War II, Rolex's success soared. In 1946, they had sold their 50,000th certified chronometer. By 1947, they doubled this figure to 100,000. In 1945, they released the Datejust, the first waterproof self-winding wristwatch to indicate the date on the dial. This was followed by the Day-Date model, which added the day of the week. In the 1950s, Rolex introduced the Submariner, the first deep-diving waterproof wristwatch that could reach 100 meters underwater. Hans Wilsdorf died in 1960, but before his death, he transferred 100% ownership of Rolex to the Wilsdorf Foundation, ensuring the company would never go public or be sold. Following Wilsdorf's death, Rolex positioned itself as the luxury brand it is today. In 1985, they began manufacturing watches with 904L steel, becoming the first watch company to do so. From an orphan boy who started with nothing, Hans Wilsdorf went his own path and revolutionized the watch industry. His passion for design and technical innovation has placed him among the most influential figures in the industry, and his legacy can be seen today in every person wearing a Rolex. If you're inspired by the stories of extraordinary individuals who dared to challenge the status quo, join our community of curious minds by subscribing to Zemu Voice. We bring you meticulously researched stories of the visionaries who have shaped our world. Which Rolex innovation do you think had the biggest impact on modern society? Let us know in the comments below.